G'day Poetry Geeks, I am Jackson and you are watching The Poetry Show. In today's Poetry Show we're going to be talking about the golden rule of writing poetry. Okay, so first things first, why should you listen to any advice from me? Well, in short, you shouldn't. If you don't feel like your poetry is ever going to be published for another human being, you don't really care what other people think of it, then you don't really need my advice. But if you have any idea about sharing it online or sharing it with other people or forcing people to read your work, then you might want to consider some of the advice I have to give you. And like I said, today we're going to focus on the golden rule. The golden rule of poetry, very simply, is read poetry. Read as much poetry as you can get your hands on. Read stuff that you're familiar with and that you love, by all means. Read stuff that challenges you as well. Read things that you think you might not like. Read things that you think deal with issues that you think you don't care about. Just try and read as widely and as broadly as you can. When it comes to reading poetry, you want to read with an open mind and you want to try and give the poet that you're reading the benefit of the doubt, at least for the purposes of this exercise of becoming a better poet yourself. The idea behind this is basically, if you find poetry that has been published, be it online or in a literary journal or in a book or any way that you found poetry, however you stumble across it, somebody thought it was good enough to publish. It might only be the poet, because it might be on their own blog, or it might be in a literary journal where, you know, real poets have all sat down and decided that this is a real poem. So you might want to read that and figure out for yourself, what is it about this poem that people thought was worth sharing? When I say read experimentally, I also mean read things that don't quite fit into your understanding of what a poem should be. And again, give the poet the benefit of the doubt. Think about why they're doing what they're doing. It might challenge your understanding of what poetry is, but I think that's okay, that's a good thing. So that's the golden rule of poetry, read more poetry. The reason this is important in particular is because if you want to produce poetry that you think other people should write, then I think you have an obligation to be the sort of person who thinks poetry is worth reading. And if you think poetry is worth reading, which is why you write it, then you should read it. If you're a struggling artist and you can't afford literary journals or you can't afford to go out and buy poetry, you can go to the library. It's that easy. You can look online. You can find poetry that may be of a lesser quality online, but read it anyway because you should be reading poetry. So, if you have particular poems that you would like to share with the world, whether they're your own poems or they are poems that you've connected with in a particularly strong way, then leave them in the comments underneath this video, and then that will give people an initial source that they can go to try and find some poems. I like to try and read a piece of poetry every day. It might be an excerpt from a book of poems that I'm reading, it might be just something that I found in the newspaper, or it might be, but I try and find something every day, and I encourage you to try and find a piece of poetry every day that speaks to you. And it might say things to you that you don't like, but that's okay. So leave some poetry in the comments, other people can read what you think is a good poem, and I will catch you next time. And also read poets that defy your own politics. You know, you might be a horrible, racist, bigoted scumbag, and in your own circle, in your own life, as long as I don't have to engage with you, that's okay. But you should still go ahead and read stuff by like Derek Walcott. Read Derek Walcott's The Prodigal, or read Grace Nichols' The Fat Black Woman's poems. Read stuff that you wouldn't normally read because you're a racist, horrible person, but read it anyway. You don't have to tell any of your racist friends that you did, but read it because it's important that you expand your mind a little bit. I can't say that. So that's it. That's the golden rule of poetry. Read as much poetry as you can get your hands on, particularly if you find it in places where you don't normally expect to find poetry. You know, if somebody's scribbled a line of verse on I don't know, the window of the bus you're riding on, or somebody's written it on the back of the toilet door, then read it, because it's there and you don't come across poetry very often in your life, so you might as well read it. That's terrible advice.